Chapter 9 of The Horror Expert by Frank Belknap Long. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 9. It might have been a repeat of a conference that had taken place in the Eaton Lathrop offices several days earlier, if twice the original number of people hadn't been present. Like the earlier conference, it was held in Macklin's office, and in addition to Macklin, Eaton, Young Hansen, and Ellers, there were 2 women and 2 police officers present. It was a conference, in a strictly official sense. Lieutenant Fenton had made it plain that there were a number of weighty matters to be discussed, and that he wished precisely 8 people to be present. The 8, of course, included first-grade Detective Gallison and himself. One of the women was Lynn Prentice, the other Susan Wheel, who presided over the seldom idle switchboard in the outer office. As before, it was Macklin who seemed the most intent on asking blunt questions and challenging the opinion of the majority. Even Fenton came under challenge, and the big detective seemed content to let Macklin talk on for several minutes in almost uninterrupted fashion for many of the points which the boyish-looking editor brought up. He was almost phenomenally youthful-looking for a man in his 40s, Fenton told himself, seemed both discerning and well-taken. "I don't understand," Macklin was saying, "why there should be any doubt left in your mind, Lieutenant, as to the guilt of the man you've just arrested and charged with Gerstel's murder." "Not as to Gerstel's murder," Fenton said. "I thought I made that very plain. He will go before a jury for killing Gerstel, but the other 2 slayings—" "For Pete's sake, Lieutenant," Macklin said, leaning a little forward and giving him no time to finish. "You've arrested the owner of the motor cruiser, and he turns out to be someone Helen Lathrop had known for 5 years. Not to mince words, John Darby had been her lover for that length of time, if not longer. They quarreled, and she broke off with him 6 times. But just recently the fire started burning again, for both of them. He practically admits all that, because I guess he knows he'd gain nothing by denying it. What he doesn't admit is that they quarreled again even more recently." Macklin paused an instant, as if to emphasize the importance of what he was about to say. Then he went on in a tone of absolute conviction. "Isn't it all pretty obvious? When the fire started burning again, she sat on Gerstel's story, wouldn't let him run it. It was big, but that didn't matter. She was determined to protect Darby. Then it stands to reason they must have quarreled again. You'll never get him to admit that, because it supplies the strongest kind of motive for murder, and would be the equivalent of a complete confession. They quarreled again, and she threatened to give Gerstel the green light, and that's why he killed her. A pretty drastic way of making sure," Fenton said. "Why didn't he try making up again with her?" "He probably did and got nowhere. When once her mind was made up, it usually stayed that way. Really made up, I mean. She might have quarreled with Darby off and on for years, enjoyed letting him dangle, but this time she probably turned absolutely venomous. Consider what kind of man he is. That's important, too. A Cafe Society procurer, a flesh-for-sale racketeer with a Capital Gains League clientele. Big names in Hollywood, in the TV industry, not to mention the magazine field. Consider how far that kind of upper-echelon pimp would go if she thought she was about to blow his $5 million a year racket sky high, and himself along with it. Of course Darby killed her." "And Ruth Porges, too?" Fenton asked. Macklin nodded. "She worked here, didn't she? I knew that Gerstel was working on something big which she didn't want him to publish, and she may have found out more than either Hansen or I knew or suspected. She may have found out too much for him to let her go on living. It all hangs together, doesn't it? It would be the wildest kind of coincidence if Darby just murdered Gerstel and somebody else killed Helen Lathrop and Ruth Porges." "I'm afraid I can't agree," Fenton said quietly. "It would be the wildest kind of coincidence if the 3 crimes were not closely related. But they were, very closely, even if a different person committed the first 2, and for an entirely different reason." "And I'm afraid I can't follow your line of reasoning," Macklin said. He grinned suddenly. "I don't know why I should be raising problems for the police to worry about, when you're so convinced that you know just who did murder Helen Lathrop and why." "We know," Fenton said. "Then why don't you arrest him, then?" "We intend to," Fenton said. "But first I'd like to point out the flaw in your line of reasoning. You've just said the flame started up again between Helen Lathrop and Darby, and she sat on Gerstel's exposé. That we know. Darby, as you say, has practically admitted it, because he knows it would remove any motive he might have had for killing Helen Lathrop. He'd have a very special reason for wanting her to stay alive, and he did want her to stay alive, you can be sure of that." "Not if she quarreled with him again still later," Macklin said. "Just have patience," Fenton said. "I'm coming to that. What makes you so sure she quarreled with him again, in a deadly serious way this time, and was going to expose him? We haven't uncovered a shred of evidence pointing in that direction. It just possibly might be true, because she was a quarrelsome woman. But even if it were true, he didn't kill her for that, or any other reason. He didn't kill her, period. If they had another quarrel, I rather suspect he'd have known how to talk himself back into her good graces again. So the whole quarrel motive is pure assumption on your part. A very plausible assumption, Macklin pointed out. Under ordinary circumstances it would be, Finn conceded. But it carries no weight at all now, because we know who murdered Helen Lathrop and, well, we can make a pretty good guess as to why he did it, even if we're not absolutely sure about his motive. Fenton nodded, his lips tightening a little. By the same token, we know that Darby couldn't have murdered her. He happens to have an unbreakable alibi for that particular morning, and the two hoodlums who kidnapped Hanson have just as good an alibi, and they were the only professional gun-carrying characters in his employ, as far as we've been able to determine. But Darby couldn't have murdered her anyway, because someone else did. Someone else went into her office and shot her dead, and it was that which started the fire under Darby. With Lathrop dead, Darby had no longer a beautiful, protective guardian angel, or crime-blinking witch, if you'd prefer that term, to keep the exposé under wraps, and Gerstle would have had a field day. And Gerstle was going ahead with it, not telling anyone, not even Mr. Eaton or Hanson here, although Darby made the mistake of thinking Hanson did know and had him kidnapped also to silence him. Macklin shook his head. "Oh, I'm sorry, Lieutenant, I just can't buy it. I'm willing to be convinced, of course, if you've strong evidence to support it, but otherwise." "We've the strongest kind of evidence," Fenton said. "Short of what an eyewitness would be able to tell us, no jury could listen to expert testimony regarding it and stay locked up for more than 10 or 15 minutes. He paused for a moment to stare around the office. His gaze lingered for an instant on Ehlers, and it seemed to Lynn Prentice, up to that moment her own gaze had rested on Macklin and the detective, that the elderly editor paled slightly. But Hanson and Eaton appeared ill at ease, too, the publisher extremely so, and even Susan Wheel grew a little restive under the big detective's prolonged scrutiny. It was to Susan that he spoke. "The switchboard keeps you pretty busy, doesn't it, Miss Wheel?" he said. "If someone came out of one of the offices on this side of the reception desk and darted past you, I'm using that word deliberately because it describes the way he probably moved, it would be quite possible for him to reach Miss Lathrop's office on the other side of the desk division unobserved, I should imagine. Your back would be turned because the switchboard faces toward the outer door, isn't that so?" Susan wet her lips before replying, but her answer was decisive enough. "Yes, sir. I'm quite sure I wouldn't have seen him if I was plugging in a call." "Then if he had darted back again a few moments later, it stands to reason you wouldn't have seen him then either, if you happened to be answering another call, or even if you just happened to have your back turned. It would have been very easy for him to pause an instant before darting back to make sure that your back would be turned." Susan nodded. "That's right, sir. When someone comes into the outer office, I usually see him right away, because I just have to glance sideways. But I seldom turn around and look behind me unless an editor speaks to me. Editors pass back and forth all the time, and even when I hear them, I seldom turn around." "I see," Fenton said. "That would have cut down the risk for him, made it even easier. But I imagine he did his best to dart past as quickly and silently as possible. Did you hear the sound of the silenced gun, Miss Wheel?" "Yes, I'm sure I did. But it didn't make much of an impression on me until Miss Prentice came out a minute or two later and told me that she'd heard it also. It seemed to trouble her a great deal." "Yes, well, that's all I wanted to know." He looked directly at Lynn. "How long was it, Miss Prentice, before you got up, after hearing the sound, and went to investigate? I questioned you about that on the day of the murder, but it wasn't of such vital importance then. I mean, it didn't seem so to us at the time. It should have, and I blame myself for it. Please try to think back again, and narrow it down as much as you can. A half minute, a minute and a half." "It's hard to be sure," Lynn said, wetting her lips as Susan had done. "I should say about 1 minute. I remember that I just sat staring at the manuscript I'd been working on, blue-penciled mentally a third of a page, in fact. Then my curiosity got the better of me." She sighed helplessly. "I really don't know. It could have been as long as 2 or 3 full minutes." "Time enough for the murderer to get back into his office on this side of the switchboard, if he moved quickly." "Yes, I should think so." "That was not a question, Miss Lynn. It was a statement. For my part, I'm sure of it. In view of what you've just said, It could have easily been all of 3 minutes, time enough and to spare.
Yes,
Lynn murmured, moistening her lips again. Just one more question, Miss Prentice. The typewriters you said you heard clattering away. If one of them had stopped for as long as 10 minutes, would you have realized it had stopped? If it started up again the instant you stepped out of your office? Think now. Several typewriters, a great deal of sound, and you were engrossed in your editing, even if it had been the typewriter in the office next to yours. That, too, Lynn was to realize later, had been more of a statement than a question, for Fenton did not even wait for her to reply. He looked directly at Macklin and said, "It's your typewriter I'm talking about, I'm afraid. You didn't know she'd heard the sound of your silenced gun. But the instant she stepped out into the hall, some instinct warned you that you'd have nothing to lose by battering away on your machine again. It would certainly help to make her believe you hadn't left this office at all. Not even long enough to dart past the reception desk, shoot Helen Lathrop through the head, and dart straight back again." Macklin paled visibly, but not a muscle of his face moved. He sat very quietly, returning Fenton's accusing stare, a strangely withdrawn look in his eyes, as if he had half anticipated exposure and had steeled himself to endure the agony of it, if it came, by erecting a kind of mental block within himself. "We found the gun you killed her with in Ruth Porge's apartment," Fenton said, not unkindly. He could never bring himself to speak without compassion to a man who was certain to die. "We'll never know where she found it, unless you tell us, but we don't have to know. Ballistics has identified it as the murder gun. You searched her apartment after you strangled her, even tore apart 2 mattresses in your search. But you didn't look inside the flushing compartment of the toilet. It would have been so easy for you to go into the bathroom, lift the lid, and look. But I guess you just didn't think of it. It's your gun, Macklin. A war souvenir gun with a long black barrel. The kind of gun some men, with your kind of war record, like to show to friends. Possibly you showed it to her once. But that's also something we'll never know unless you tell us. But she must have known it was your gun, or she would not have attempted to hide it. If she'd found a stranger's gun, the gun of someone she had no reason to respect or like or want to protect, she'd have gone straight to the police with it. She must have felt you were justified in killing Helen Lathrop. If you did show the gun to her once, that wouldn't have prevented you from using it. You had no way of knowing she'd find it and that it would be traced to you. War souvenir guns are often very hard to trace to their owners. But we had very little trouble tracing this one. You're tagged with it, Macklin. You're also tagged with a fingerprint you left in Ruth Porge's apartment. I can imagine you wore gloves and were very careful, but not careful enough. Remember taking one glove off for a moment. Well, it's not too important so long as we have that one very fine print. Fenton sighed and his voice hardened a little. Would you like to tell us why you killed her, Macklin? I must warn you, though, that anything you say now... Macklin seemed not to hear him. He spoke softly, almost gently, as if the violence which had taken 2 human lives had been long since spent. There are 2 kinds of men in this world, leaving abnormality out of it. One kind I think is very rare. The old saying, love is a woman's whole life, to men a thing apart, isn't always true. There are men to whom love is everything. I've always been that kind of man. And when she betrayed the great love I had for her, as she betrayed the others, A look of torment came into his eyes. It would have been better if she had been the one to slay, to kill me then, without compassion and without remorse. But that was one cruelty she was incapable of, and so I had no choice. Every man has a choice, Macklin, Fenton said. There was no need. Fenton was later to regret that he had not been more careful, not stayed more alert and on guard. But when a man does not in the least resemble a killer in his outer aspect, when he can grin boyishly and disarm everyone with his blunt forthrightness, his wry humor, his complete absence of even the everyday garden variety kind of neuroticism which afflicts 9 men and women out of 10, when in short he seems more robustly wholesome, normal than a football player with a well-rounded love life, it is very easy for a man to go a little astray emotionally and assume that he can't be too dangerous in an immediate way. Fenton had not realized that Gallison was standing so close to Macklin's desk, facing away from Macklin, and that the police positive on Gallison's hip could be a very formidable weapon in the hands of a killer still bent on saving his skin. The realization came a split second too late. Macklin had reached for the gun, whipped it from its holster, and was gripping it firmly before Gallison could swing about. and swinging about did Gallison no good, for by that time he was weaponless. Macklin snapped off the safety catch and fired twice. The first bullet struck Gallison in the right thigh, wrenching a groan from him and dropping him to his knees. Blood spurted, spraying out over the floor. The second shot, also aimed at Gallison, missed its mark. It went wild, causing Lynn Prentice to cry out and clutch at her side. Beneath her fingers a dull stain grew. She swayed a little, staggered toward the desk, and clung to it, supporting herself with one hand, staring at Fenton in mute appeal. Fenton had his own gun out now and was taking careful aim at Macklin, who was heading for the door. But before he could fire, Macklin was out of the office and was racing down the hall, Gallison's gun still in his clasp. Macklin reached the reception desk and started toward the door of the outer office, but he never reached the door. A tall, very thin young man with a sheaf of drawings under his arm had just entered the outer office, and he had heard Lynn's stricken cry. He was all very confused about everything, but the cry did something to him because he recognized Lynn's voice and realized instantly that something quite terrible had happened. And when he saw the distraught-looking man come rushing out of the corridor with a gun in his hand, he acted on impulse, threw out one leg and tripped the man up, sending him sprawling. A moment later, while the man with the gun was still sprawling, another very big, strong-looking man with another gun emerged from the corridor, piled on top of the man he'd tripped, and clobbered him over the head with the butt of the gun until he gave up trying to rise. It was all very confusing and hard to understand. End of Chapter 9.